Walter Greaves never asked for recognition. He never told people about the promise he made, never sought applause or gratitude for the thing he did every single morning before the sun reached over the rooftops of Fairgrove. His neighbors knew him as the quiet man with the flannel coat, the one who always had a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a bag of old rags in the other. They might have assumed he was just a stickler for routine or one of those old-timers who found comfort in repetition. But if they were up early enough, really early, they might have seen him walking the gravel path toward the chapel just off Mill Street. And if they followed him there, they would have found him kneeling before a weather-worn Virgin Mary statue with a soft bristle brush in hand, wiping dust from the folds of her robe like it was the most sacred job in the world. The statue wasn't grand, not like the ones you'd find in cathedrals or glossy brochures for European tours. She stood barely taller than a man, arms outstretched, her face calm but distant. The paint had chipped in places over the years, and ivy from the nearby trellis had started to creep up around her feet. Most locals walked past her without a second glance, not out of disrespect, but out of habit. She'd always been there, part of the town's backdrop, like the crumbling post office or the boarded-up bakery with its faded pink awning. But to Walter, she was more than cement and paint. She was the last thing his wife looked at before the ambulance doors closed. She was the only thing left in town that hadn't moved, hadn't left, hadn't changed. It started with just a sweep. One morning after church, Walter noticed the leaves had piled up around her base. He brought a broom the next day, then a cloth, then a bucket. Over time, it turned into a daily ritual, one he never skipped, not for storms, not for holidays, not even for the winter his knees began to fail him. He'd limp up the walkway before dawn, wipe the statue clean, trim the flowers people sometimes left behind, and whisper a quiet greeting. "Mornin', ma'am," he'd say. That was it. No long prayers. Just the way you'd greet someone you'd known a long, long time. Most didn't ask why he did it. Those who did never got a straight answer. He'd just shrug and say something about keeping things tidy. But the truth was buried somewhere deeper between the vow he whispered when the cancer took Ruth and the quiet hope that maybe, if he kept showing up, something or someone would notice. And whether it was faith or habit or both, Walter never missed a day. Not even the morning he bought the lottery ticket that would make the whole town remember the statue they'd forgotten. Fairgrove wasn't the kind of place you found on purpose. It sat off a back road that most GPS systems forgot, nestled between hills that never quite turned green in spring and a river that ran brown even in the best of seasons. There were no billboards, no welcome signs with witty slogans, just a sagging wooden post at the county line that said Fairgrove 3 miles in fading white paint. It used to be a town built on 3 things: family, routine, and faith. There was a time when the church bell rang loud enough to hush arguments, when people left pies on porches instead of locking their doors, and when Sunday mornings meant full pews and quiet reverence. But that was a long time ago. Now, Fairgrove felt more like a waiting room no one had cleaned in years. The grocery store closed at 6, the pharmacy didn't open on Wednesdays, and the last time the local paper printed an actual paper, it was to announce the mayor's funeral. The chapel where the Virgin Mary statue stood hadn't held a regular mass in over a decade. The priest had retired to Florida, and the diocese hadn't sent a replacement. Still, someone no one really knew who kept the doors unlocked, and the altar cloth changed with the seasons. The candles were always stocked, and the floors, while creaky, remained clean. Most assumed a group of quiet old ladies did it, the kind who didn't need praise to do what was right. But in truth, it was mostly Walter. He never asked for keys. He just started showing up, and the place welcomed him like it had been waiting. The chapel had once been the town's heart, the place where baptisms, weddings, funerals, and fall bake sales all took place under the same roof. Now it was just there. A stone building with peeling paint and silence so thick you could hear the drip from the leaky faucet in the sacristy. Kids rode bikes past it like it was haunted. Teens used its back steps for late-night smokes and whispered dares. And the statue, well, she'd been standing there for so long, most people forgot why she was placed there to begin with. But the old folks remembered. They remembered when she was carried in by volunteers from the quarry, when she was blessed with oil and song, when every child was told to never turn their back to her. Over the years, memories faded. Names on headstones wore down. Even the marble on the Virgin's face softened from the rain and wind. But Walter noticed. He noticed every smudge, every cobweb, every bit of moss creeping up her base. He noticed that the town didn't look at her anymore. Not until something happened, something that would force Fairgrove to remember the blessing it had forgotten, and the man who never did. At first, it was just something to do. A quiet act to fill the silence Ruth left behind. The mornings were hardest before the town woke up, before the coffee brewed, before his phone stopped vibrating with sympathy calls that slowly gave way to silence. Walter had never been the kind of man to talk about grief. He didn't cry at the funeral, he didn't speak at the burial, but the morning after they laid her to rest, he walked down to the chapel with a rag in his coat pocket and wiped the bird droppings off the Virgin Mary's shoulder like it was the most important thing he could do. He didn't know why. It just felt necessary. That one moment became a second, then a week, then a month. The chapel steps creaked the same way every day under his boots. The gate squealed, the statue stood still, and Walter scrubbed. Sometimes he hummed. Sometimes he said nothing. Once, he whispered Ruth's name. The wind carried it away before it could echo. After a while, he began to leave a single flower at the base, wild ones from the ditch. Sometimes a daisy, sometimes something yellow he couldn't name. No one asked why he did it. No one was around to see him, really. That made it feel more honest. Some people need a church service to feel close to God. Walter only needed this. The quiet before sunrise, the creak of the chapel door, the chill in the air. The Virgin's painted eyes were always downcast, always calm, like she was listening but never judging. Ruth used to say that about her too, how she preferred statues to sermons. They listen better, she'd joke, tapping the side of the pew with her ring finger. When she got sick, she stopped going to church altogether. But Walter kept going, even if it was just to sit in the back with his hat in his lap, staring at the folds in the stained glass instead of the altar. Cleaning the statue gave his day structure, like bookends on a life that had gone quiet. He didn't think of it as prayer, not really. But some days, he found himself talking aloud while he wiped the dust from her robe. About the weather, about Ruth, about the ache in his knees. Sometimes he asked for nothing, just said thank you. For what? He didn't always know. But something in the rhythm of it all arrived. Clean, pause, leave, turned into more than habit. It became a vow. Not one he spoke aloud, but one he honored with every breath he took before sunrise. And though he never expected anything in return, part of him wondered, deep down, if it was being noticed. Because there's a difference between superstition and faith. Superstition is fear wrapped in habit. Faith is love wrapped in action. And Walter Greaves, who never missed a day, was a man acting on something far deeper than anyone knew, not even himself. It was early March when Walter noticed something odd, the kind of thing most people wouldn't even register, but he had been coming to that statue long enough to know when something wasn't right. He'd brought his usual rag and his little spray bottle with diluted vinegar, nothing fancy, just enough to cut the grime off stone, and knelt to begin wiping down the base. But there was nothing there. No silt from the gravel path, no film from the rain, no spider web tucked in the folds of the Virgin's sleeve like there usually was after a windy night. The surface felt smooth, as though someone else had already cleaned it. But that wasn't possible. No one else ever came this early. At first he figured maybe it was just a calm night. No wind, no dust kicked up by passing cars. But over the next few days, the pattern held. He arrived at the same time, hands wrapped tight around the thermos he'd had since the 80s, and each morning the statue looked untouched. Not just clean, pristine. No bird droppings on her shoulder, no leaves curled near her feet. Even the roses in the pot at her side, which had been wilted since winter, looked less dead somehow. He said nothing. Not to the man at the hardware store he sometimes chatted with, not to the neighbor who waved from his porch. He didn't want to sound like the kind of old man who told stories just to hear himself talk. But the truth bothered him, not in a fearful way, exactly. More like the way you feel when something familiar changes shape, just enough to make you question your memory. Walter began to test it, in small ways. He left a pebble on the base one evening. Just a tiny one, wedged near her foot. The next morning, it was gone. He figured maybe a raccoon had knocked it off, or the wind carried it away. So he tried again. This time with a folded piece of tissue, tucked carefully between two curls of her robe. He arrived the next day and found it resting on the chapel's wooden bench, instead unfolded, dry, and clean. He said nothing aloud, but he looked at her longer than usual that day. The statue's face remained the same stone still. Eyes lowered, but something in the air around her felt heavier. charged, almost. Not threatening, but aware. Like walking into a room just after someone important has left. He stepped back and sat on the bench where the tissue had been. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the light was pale and stretched across the lawn in wide beams, catching on dew and casting soft shadows across her face. For a moment, Walter forgot the ache in his joints, the emptiness of his house, the weariness in his bones. He just sat there, staring, as if waiting for something he couldn't name. The statue had always been still, but now, for the first time, Walter wondered if stillness meant silence or attention. Walter never played the lottery, not because he was against it, but because it never occurred to him. He wasn't a gambling man. Ruth used to say they had already hit life's jackpot just by finding each other, and he believed her. So when he stepped into the corner gas station that Wednesday afternoon to buy a bottle of window cleaner and a pack of batteries, he hadn't planned on buying a ticket. The clerk, young, tired-looking, with a ballpoint pen tucked behind one ear, was chatting with another customer when Walter set his items on the counter. "Got any luck left today, Mr. Greaves?" the kid asked, half joking, nodding toward the glowing lottery terminal beside the register. Walter chuckled, shaking his head. But before he could answer, the customer beside him laughed and said, "Buy one. Maybe you'll hit it big and get out of this place." It was a throwaway comment, a joke about the state of the town. But something in it lingered. Walter reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, and placed it beside the cleaner. "Why not?" he said, not because he wanted to win, but because he was tired of saying no to small things. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "You want to pick your numbers, or let the machine do it?" Walter shrugged. "You choose." The clerk tapped a few buttons, hit the auto-pick option, and the machine spat out a single slip of paper. 7 digits in neat, bold font. Walter didn't look at them. He folded the ticket once, then twice, and tucked it into the side pocket of his flannel coat, wedging it behind an old grocery receipt and a button he'd meant to sew back onto a pair of pants last fall. He didn't think about it again. The moment passed, the batteries were paid for. The door chimed behind him as he stepped back into the chilled afternoon wind, the sun already starting to dip behind the trees. That night, he placed the ticket on the kitchen counter without a glance. It sat beside an unopened envelope from the power company and a chipped mug he kept forgetting to fix. He had no idea what numbers had been printed on it. He didn't even know when the draw was. It wasn't a prayer, it wasn't a wish. It was just a piece of paper until it wasn't. The next morning, as he walked back to the chapel with his rag in one hand and thermos in the other, Walter passed the empty bus stop, the rusting mailbox, and the old tire swing no one had touched in years. The statue was waiting, just like always. Her gaze lowered, her hands extended. He set down his things, reached out to brush a leaf from her shoulder, and paused. The leaf blew off on its own, drifting upward, not down. Just once. A single strange motion. Then the air went still. Behind him, in a pocket forgotten, 7 numbers sat waiting, and none of them were his. It was a Friday morning when the chapel stopped breathing. That's how Walter would describe it later, though he wouldn't know why those words fit so well. The sky was the same soft gray it had been all week. The streetlights still clicked off too late, and the wind dragged the scent of damp earth across the sidewalks. But something was different the moment Walter turned the chapel's iron gate latch. The sound didn't echo. It didn't click or squeak or bounce off the stone the way it always had. It just opened silent, smooth, like the air had absorbed the sound before it could form. He paused on the steps. The candle he'd lit the day before still flickered behind the stained glass. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes they burned longer than expected. But the others, 4 votives left by passers-by earlier in the week, half-burned and crooked in their holders, were still alight too. And not just flickering, but standing perfectly vertical, as if held in place by an invisible glass. No wind, no sway, just straight flames in a motionless room. Walter stepped inside, and the smell hit him first. Not dust or wax or damp wood, but roses. Sharp, clean, and unmistakable. The kind Ruth used to grow in the front yard, the ones that never bloomed after she passed. There were no fresh flowers in the chapel. The vases had been empty for weeks, but the scent was everywhere, filling the aisles, clinging to the hymnals, tucked inside the folds of the kneeling cushions. He moved slowly, setting down his thermos on the pew's edge. Even his footsteps sounded wrong. Not muffled, not loud, just absent. The creak of the floorboards beneath him didn't come. The usual pop of the old heater in the wall didn't kick on. Even the birds outside, the ones that nested near the roof, had gone quiet. It was as if the whole building had been wrapped in glass. And at the center of it all, the statue. She stood in her usual place, just outside the chapel doors beneath the stone archway, backlit by the soft, diffused morning light. Her robe looked smoother somehow, her hands more defined, her face a shade less worn. Walter took a slow breath and raised the cloth in his hand, but found himself unable to move toward her. Not afraid, just uninvited. It felt like walking into a room already full, though he was alone. He backed away, not out of fear, but respect. Like something was in progress, like someone was listening. When he stepped outside again, the wind picked up all at once. A sudden gust, not strong, but startling. The maple branches overhead swayed. The rusted wind chimes from the neighboring yard let out a soft, delayed ring. The sound returned. The air shifted. Walter blinked, looked back at the statue, and for a moment thought he saw something impossible, her shadow moving in the wrong direction. But it passed, or so he told himself. And still, the ticket sat on his kitchen counter, untouched. In a place like Fairgrove, doubt isn't loud. It doesn't shout from rooftops or clash in city council meetings. It seeps in slowly, like humidity through cracked windows. People here don't argue about miracles, they just stop mentioning them. The statue outside the chapel had once been the center of whispered stories and folded hands, but by now, most folks drove past it without looking up. Not out of spite, just out of habit. Belief had eroded quietly, like paint flaking off the town's welcome sign. Everyone remembered the old days, but few believed they'd ever come back. At Vinnie's Hardware, talk was mostly about the price of diesel and whether the river was going to flood again. The old men in the chairs by the window didn't speak much about God anymore, not unless someone had died. Even then, it was more tradition than conviction. "He's in a better place," they'd mutter, without looking up. But their eyes said something different. Tired, unconvinced. Walter was one of the few people left who still treated the statue as more than decoration. People noticed, sure, but they didn't say much. The cashier at the gas station once joked, "Old Walt's got a crush on that statue," and everyone laughed the way you do when something's a little too true. A teenager had spray-painted the back wall of the chapel last fall. No one cleaned it but Walter. The local paper didn't even mention it. That silence said more than an article ever could. Some thought Walter was stuck in time. A man who didn't know how to move on. A relic, just like the statue he cleaned. Others felt sorry for him, saw the daily routine as a symptom of loneliness, not faith. "He needs a hobby," they'd say, or a dog. But no one stopped him. No one told him to quit. They just let him be, like people let the wind rustle the flags on the graves out of the cemetery, something old and harmless. The church hadn't held mass in years. The last priest to serve full-time had retired after a stroke, and the diocese never sent another. The altar was still intact, but the pews had grown stiff and cold, like benches in a waiting room no one ever visited. The only thing that still looked the same was the statue. Somehow, she hadn't aged. Or maybe she had, and only Walter noticed the difference. The way the paint at her hairline had faded to the palest gold. The way the tips of her fingers seemed more defined than before. No one in Fairgrove believed in miracles anymore. Not really. They believed in overdue bills and weather patterns and the slow drip of time. And yet, when the numbers were announced that Sunday night, and the local news named a Walter Greaves of Fairgrove as the sole winner of a staggering, record-breaking jackpot, people stopped talking mid-sentence. Because while no one believed in miracles, they all remembered who cleaned that statue. The winning ticket sat exactly where he'd left, it wedged under a chipped coffee mug, beside a week-old receipt for canned soup and an envelope he hadn't bothered to open. Walter didn't rush to check it. In fact, he didn't even know the lottery numbers had been drawn. He didn't own a television. The radio in his truck worked, but the antenna had snapped off years ago, and he only ever turned it on when the weather looked dangerous. He had no phone alerts, no email reminders. So when the clerk at the gas station leaned over the counter and said, "Hey, Mr. Greaves, you didn't happen to buy a ticket Wednesday, did you?" Walter blinked like he'd just been pulled from a daydream. He nodded, slow. "Think I did." "Why?" The kid's face went pale. "They said somebody in town won. The full thing. Not a share everything. Said it was from this store. Auto pick ticket. Walter's brow furrowed. Huh. He sipped his coffee, more out of habit than thirst. Well, can't be me. I didn't even look at it. That part was true. He hadn't. And even now, standing there with a paper sleeve around a cup that was too hot for his fingers, he felt no rush to run home and check. It didn't feel real, not in the way that mattered. He hadn't made a wish, hadn't prayed for wealth, hadn't stared at the numbers, hoping they'd match. He'd bought the ticket because someone offered, and he was tired of being the man who always said no. But when he got home, something nudged him. Not a voice, not a thought, just a pause. The kind that comes right before a memory hits. He set the coffee down, walked to the kitchen, and peeled the ticket out from its cluttered nook. It was bent now, curled slightly at the edges. The numbers were still clear. 6, 4, 8, 7, 2, 2, 1. He didn't know them by heart, but something about the sequence looked right. Familiar in a way numbers shouldn't be. He laid the ticket on the table, then turned on the small transistor radio by the window, one of the few things Ruth had insisted on keeping, long after everyone else had thrown theirs away. The announcer was just finishing the midday news when the winning numbers replayed in a casual, almost bored tone. But Walter didn't hear the voice. He only heard silence. Deep, echoing, like the chapel had been that morning. The numbers matched. Every single one. He stared at the slip of paper for a long time, then looked out the window toward the chapel. He couldn't see the statue from where he stood, but he felt her there, like always, watching, still. And instead of excitement or shock, Walter only felt a strange kind of stillness, as if the world had moved around him, but he'd stayed exactly where he was meant to be. Walter didn't tell anyone. Not that day. Not the next. The ticket sat on his kitchen table beneath a chipped ceramic bowl, like it was nothing more than a leftover grocery list. It wasn't disbelief that kept him quiet. It was reverence. He'd never asked for this, not once. And now that it had come, uninvited, unexplained, and too precise to ignore, he wasn't sure what to do with it. What do you do when the impossible walks through your door without knocking? You listen. So he did what he always did. He got up before dawn, filled the thermos, and walked the path toward the chapel like every morning before. But the air felt different, charged, like before a summer storm. The gravel crunched sharper beneath his boots. The street lamps flickered once, then steadied. And as he stepped through the gate, the wind fell dead again. Not a rustle in the trees. Not a chirp from the birds. He paused outside the chapel door. Something inside told him not to rush. The air was thick inside. Not with heat or dust, but with presence. That was the only word that came to mind. It was like stepping into a space that had been waiting for him, holding its breath. The candles from the night before had burned out, but the faint scent of wax and roses still clung to the walls. And then it came. A sound. Not loud. Not even clear. Just a single, whispered breath. Walter stopped mid-step. He turned, expecting someone behind him. But the chapel was empty. He moved closer to the statue, hands shaking now, cloth forgotten in his coat pocket. The whisper came again, this time just above the threshold of hearing. Like something spoken through water, or from inside a dream. It wasn't in English, it wasn't in any language Walter knew, but it didn't need to be. It said, "You were heard." That's what he felt. Not words in the air, but in the chest, in the ribs, like a truth blooming behind the sternum. His knees gave slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper. Like gravity had shifted just around him, he knelt before the statue without thinking, without pride, and placed both hands on the base like it was the altar at his own wedding. And in that moment, something warm passed over him. Not heat, not wind. A presence, gentle, steady, familiar. Ruth had always said the Virgin Mary didn't need miracles to prove herself. She just needs someone to come close enough to listen, she used to whisper when they lit candles together. And now, years after her voice had gone silent, Walter finally understood what she meant. The whisper didn't come again. It didn't need to. He stood slowly, reverently, and touched the edge of the statue's robe, brushing off a speck of dust that wasn't there. Then he walked out into the morning light, just a man, with a secret and a ticket he didn't ask for. It was the kind of light that didn't make sense. Not a spotlight, not a reflection, not the glow of a candle or the flicker of headlights turning a corner. It didn't move, didn't flicker, didn't pulse like things touched by electricity. It just hovered soft and blue, like the color of hydrangeas after a storm. Walter saw it 3 nights after the whisper, long after he should have been asleep. He hadn't meant to return that late, but sleep wouldn't come, and the silence in the house had become heavier than usual. He found himself pacing without reason, his slippers making soft, shushing sounds across the wood floor. At 3:12 a.m., he checked the front door. At 3:19, he was already walking. No flashlight, no jacket, just the itch to be near the chapel, to be near her. Fairgrove at night was silent in a way only rural towns can be. No sirens, no cars, just the hum of faraway power lines and the occasional rustle of wind through empty trees. As Walter approached the chapel, he slowed. Something in him already knew. He could feel it on the back of his arms, in the ridges of his spine like a song beginning before the first note. The light was waiting. It floated around the statue's shoulders, gentle and unmoving. Not bright enough to illuminate the path, but not dim enough to miss. It didn't cast shadows, it just was. Resting against her robe, outlining her silhouette with the faintest shimmer. Walter stepped carefully, quietly, not wanting to startle whatever had allowed him to witness this. And then he saw it, her face. The statue's eyes, usually shaded by the tilt of her head, were fully visible. Not glowing, not open, but clearer. Like the stone had softened for just a moment, and in that softness, something human emerged. Not in expression, but in presence. The air around her shimmered faintly, not like heat, but like breath. A slow, unseen exhale. Walter stood in the shadow of that moment, unsure whether to kneel or run. But the light didn't move toward him. It didn't beckon. It simply stayed, like a hand resting gently on the shoulder of time. He whispered, "I don't understand." The light dimmed slightly, not as a response, but like it was acknowledging the question without answering it. And then, just as quietly as it had come, it disappeared. Not like a switch flipped, but like a veil falling. One moment it was there. The next, only darkness. The statue stood the same as always, arms open, gaze lowered, still and silent. Walter waited a long time before turning back down the path. His knees ached, his breath fogged in the cold. But something inside him felt steadier than it had in years. He didn't speak of the light the next morning. Not to the clerk, not to the mailman, not even to the woman who left daffodils at the chapel steps every Sunday. Some lights weren't meant to be named, only noticed. And in Fairgrove, noticing had always been the first step to believing. The draw came and went without him. It aired on a Saturday night just after the local news, sandwiched between a furniture outlet commercial and an ad for heartburn medication. In most homes, it played in the background while people folded laundry or scraped dinner plates into the trash. The numbers flashed on the screen for barely 10 seconds. 7 digits, a record-breaking jackpot. One winner. That's all the anchor said before moving on to a story about road construction on Highway 18. Walter didn't see any of it. At that exact moment, he was sitting in the last pew of the chapel, hands folded over his thermos, watching the last candle burn low. He didn't know why he'd come back that evening. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the whisper. Maybe it was the light. But something in him had shifted since he heard that sound in the silence you were heard. He'd told no one. Not because he was trying to keep it secret, but because speaking it aloud might make it smaller. Outside, the wind rattled the chapel's window panes in a lazy rhythm. He didn't know it yet, but half a mile away at the corner store, the clerk was reading the winning ticket numbers off his phone and nearly dropping his coffee when he saw the location. One winning ticket sold in Fairgrove. The announcement made it to social media before it ever reached the paper. But even online, no one could figure out who the winner was. Back in the chapel, Walter rose slowly and walked toward the statue. He didn't bring the cloth that night. He didn't come to clean. He came to sit with her, to be seen, to say nothing. The kind of silence that means more than words. He studied her face, how it always seemed the same yet different each time he returned. Sometimes softer, sometimes sterner. But never cruel, never indifferent. He placed his hand gently on the stone base, worn smooth from decades of weather, and the fingers of strangers who needed something to hold on to. His palm lingered there for a long moment. There was no warmth, no glow, just stone. And still, it felt like something looked back. He whispered, not a prayer, but a confession. If this is real, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. The wind outside went still. When he got home, the ticket remained untouched. He saw it sitting beneath the bowl, next to a spoon and the power bill. He could have checked the numbers, could have turned on the radio, could have called someone, anyone, but he didn't. He poured himself a cup of water, stood at the window, and looked toward the dark outline of the chapel. Somewhere, someone knew. Maybe not a person, maybe not anyone with skin and breath. But Walter knew enough to understand that the moment had already come and passed through him like light through stained glass. He didn't recognize the number on the caller ID, but something about the timing made Walter pick up anyway. It was the gas station clerk, the same one who'd sold him the ticket without ceremony, without fanfare, just a quick beep from the machine and a polite, "Good luck." The kid's voice on the phone was shaky, uncertain. "Mr. Greaves, hey, I think we need to talk." Walter didn't say much. He never did. Just asked when would be good. By noon, he was standing inside the corner store, the air thick with the smell of fryer, oil, and bleach, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The clerk, whose name tag read Eli, looked up from behind the register, eyes wide with something between confusion and awe. "I've been checking the logs," he said, motioning for Walter to come closer. "After the news came out that the winning ticket was from this store, I went into the system. Just curious, you know? Thought maybe I'd see who paid cash, who was around. And then I saw your name." Walter nodded. He hadn't made a secret of buying it, not really. It just didn't seem important until it was. Eli swallowed, then held up the receipt copy from the lottery terminal. "This is your ticket. You remember letting me do auto pick, right?" "Didn't pick a thing," Walter confirmed. "Told you to choose." "That's just it," Eli said, his voice quieter now. "I did. I hit auto. The machine printed this, but I swear I saw different numbers on the screen. Right after I pressed the button, I looked up and saw a sequence that ended in 9, not 1. I remember because it was my mom's birthday. I almost said something." He leaned back like he was afraid of sounding crazy. "But the ticket, it's not what I saw. It's like the machine changed it after it printed. I know how that sounds. I'm not saying there's some glitch or ghost in the hardware. I'm just saying I can't explain it." Walter looked at the receipt, the bold digits staring back. 6, 4, 8, 7, 2, 2, 1. The same numbers now printed in every newspaper, whispered in every gas station, scrawled on napkins across town, like some modern-day parable. But to Eli, it was wrong. It was the right numbers but the wrong memory. They stood in silence for a long moment. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, its brakes squealing as it rounded the corner. Walter finally folded the receipt and slid it back across the counter. "Sometimes," he said softly, "you don't pick the numbers." "Endo." Eli blinked. "Then who does?" Walter didn't answer, just tapped his knuckles twice on the counter, nodded once, and turned to leave. As the bell above the door jingled behind him, the clerk stood frozen, staring at the lottery terminal like it had just told him a secret. One he wasn't sure he was ready to believe. It was a small thing. A mutter, really. One of those tired, half-spoken thoughts that slips out when you think no one's listening, not even yourself. Walter didn't remember saying it until days later, when the weight of what had happened began to settle into the quiet places of his life. He had just left the chapel that night, the one before he bought the ticket. The air had been heavy with spring fog, and the street lamp on the corner buzzed like it always did, struggling to stay lit. He had paused at the gate, hand resting on the cold metal latch, staring back at the statue under its shroud of shadow. Her silhouette against the mist looked less like stone and more like memory. He wasn't angry. He wasn't pleading. He was just tired of the silence, of the ache, of being alone so long it had started to feel like part of his posture. And without thinking, he let the words fall out of his mouth like steam. "If I ever mattered to you, show me." That was it. He didn't frame it as a prayer, didn't fold his hands, didn't kneel. He didn't even know who he was talking to exactly. God, Ruth, the marble woman who'd watched over the town longer than some of the trees had stood. But the words left his lips, and the moment passed. The gate clicked shut behind him, and the sound vanished into the fog. He forgot about it the next day, got up like always, cleaned the statue like always, bought the cleaner, the batteries, the ticket like always. But now, thinking back, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been listening. Not with ears, with something older, something deeper. Because it didn't feel like the kind of request you send out into the sky and expect to be answered. It felt like something dangerous, like knocking on a door you didn't know was still occupied. He tried to tell himself it was just coincidence, that the whisper in the chapel, the blue light, the dust that refused to settle, all of it could be explained. He tried to tell himself the ticket was just luck. A 1 in 300 million kind of luck. People win sometimes. Numbers line up. Things happen. But that night, when he stood at the kitchen sink washing a plate he'd only used once, he said the sentence again quietly this time. If I ever mattered to you, and the lights flickered. Just once. Just enough for him to notice. Walter stood still, water dripping from his hands, staring at the reflection of the statue in the darkened window. He couldn't see her, not from that distance. But somehow, she looked clearer, not closer, clearer. He dried his hands slowly, sat down at the table. And this time, when he bowed his head, it wasn't out of habit. It was something else entirely. The rain came hard that Sunday. Not a drizzle or a spring shower, but a full-throated downpour that turned gutters into rivers and gravel roads into soup. It started just after dawn and didn't let up for hours. Walter watched it through the kitchen window. The sky a heavy slab of gray pressed low against the rooftops. He'd already decided he wouldn't go to the chapel that morning, not because he didn't want to, but because the wind had picked up and his knees were flaring bad. Ruth would have told him to rest. Even the faithful can take a day, she used to say, when her hands were too swollen to turn the pages of her prayer book. But by noon, something in him shifted. The house had grown too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you know you're alone. So he pulled on his coat, took the umbrella from the hall, and stepped out into the storm. The walk to the chapel was slower than usual. The trees bowed under the weight of the water. The sidewalk was scattered with petals torn from nearby dogwoods. By the time he reached the chapel gate, his pant legs were soaked through. The first thing he noticed was the flowers. 3 bundles of fresh lilies had been left at the base of the statue, one white, one pink, one yellow. No note, no name, just sitting there, undisturbed, as if the storm had chosen to part around them. The second thing he noticed was the statue itself. Dry, completely dry. No rain on her shoulders, no water in the folds of her robe, no puddles at her feet. The surrounding stone was wet, the grass glistening with droplets, but the Virgin Mary stood untouched. Even the petals on the flowers hadn't wilted. The tips of her fingers were clean. The paint on her robe hadn't streaked. Walter reached out, slowly, and touched the edge of her base. Dry. He looked up, blinking against the rain. There was no overhang, no tree canopy, no awning above her to explain it. The statue stood fully exposed, and yet the water hadn't touched her. The umbrella slipped from his hand, forgotten, and clattered softly to the wet ground. He didn't move to pick it up. Something about the silence returned. The same stillness he'd felt during the whisper. The same charged hush from the night he saw the light. It pressed in around him, not heavy, but full. Like the air was thick, with a presence unseen. He knelt, soaked to the bone, and didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The statue, silent and dry amid the storm, had already said enough. Behind him, the rain continued to fall. The puddles rippled. The wind hissed through the grass. But in that one sacred corner of the world, not a single drop landed where it wasn't welcome. It started with one car parked at the edge of the chapel lot. An out-of-towner, engine still running, windows fogged. Then another. By the end of the week, there were 7 vehicles lined up by the curb, some with license plates from 2 counties over. They didn't come in groups. They didn't announce themselves. They just arrived, waited in their cars for a moment, then quietly stepped out one by one and walked toward the statue like they'd been called. Walter noticed them from a distance. He didn't recognize most of their faces, but he recognized the posture, the way they approached with shoulders hunched slightly, not in fear, but in reverence. Some carried flowers, some just brought themselves. Nobody talked much. They just looked. Some stood in silence, others knelt. A few cried. One man, maybe in his 40s, touched the base of the statue with his forehead and stayed that way for a full minute, unmoving. Word had gotten out. Not about the lottery, not exactly. Walter hadn't claimed it publicly. His name had made its way to the news in the smallest font possible, buried beneath a headline about regional flooding. But the details, the statue, the dust that wouldn't stick, the whisper, the light, those had spread like wildfire through whispers and kitchen table conversations. Someone told someone who told their sister, who told a friend at work. And by the time the local paper printed a small feature titled, "Man of Quiet Devotion Wins Big," the statue was already being talked about in a way it hadn't been in decades. The townspeople returned first. People Walter hadn't seen at the chapel in years. Retired school teachers, former altar boys now grown, widows who used to bring casseroles to church socials. They came not to gossip, but to see for themselves. To look at the statue, the same one they'd walked past 1,000 times, and wonder why it suddenly felt different. Then came the strangers. A woman from Missouri who claimed she'd dreamed of the statue's face, though she'd never been to Fairgrove. A couple from Ohio who'd been trying to conceive for years and said they just felt pulled here. A teenager from Lexington who left a note at the statue's base that read, "I didn't believe in anything until now." Walter never spoke to them, not unless they approached first. He'd nod, sometimes offer directions to the chapel restrooms or the old prayer candles stored in the vestibule. But mostly, he just watched. In the statue she stood, as she always had, arms open, gaze lowered, unmoving yet unmistakably present. It wasn't about the marble, or the man who cleaned it. It was about the feeling people got when they stood near her. The way their pulse slowed, the way the noise in their minds softened, the way for just a moment it felt like something unseen was paying attention. And once people felt that they told others, because miracles, even the quiet ones, don't stay dumb. No one saw who lit the candle. It was just there one morning, tall, white, plain, no ornate design, no ribbon, no note. Just a single vigil candle set carefully at the statue's base, wedged between a cluster of sunflowers and a laminated prayer card worn soft from weather and time. Walter noticed it during his usual rounds. The wax hadn't yet melted much, but the wick was blackened, proof it had burned sometime in the night. He didn't think anything of it until 3 days later, when a group of teenagers came up the path. They weren't loud or disruptive like teens sometimes are when they visit sacred places on a dare. They were curious, respectful. One of them, a girl with short hair and a hoodie 2 sizes too big, knelt down to light the same candle again. It had burned down by then, the wax now puddled and hardened into a small circle on the stone base. That's when she saw it. She called over her friend, then another. They leaned down together, brushing aside petals and leaves that had stuck to the cooling wax. Etched into the hardened white were grooves fine, delicate, as if drawn by an invisible needle. 7 digits, slightly tilted, but unmistakable. 6, 4, 8, 7, 2, 2, 1. The winning numbers. They didn't scream, didn't run. They just stood there in stunned silence, staring down at the accidental inscription as if the statue herself had pressed the code into the wax while no one was looking. One of them took a photo with their phone. Another whispered, "That's not possible." And the girl who'd lit the candle looked up slowly at the Virgin's face, her breath catching in her throat like she'd seen it change expression. Word traveled fast. By that evening, the photo had made its way across town. It showed the candle stub, the puddle of wax, and faint but clear those 7 digits curling like veins into the stone. The skeptics said it was a coincidence, that wax hardens in unpredictable ways, that someone could have scratched the numbers in when no one was watching, maybe even Walter himself. But those who had stood near the statue, before those who had felt the air shift, who had heard silence take on weight, didn't need to be convinced. Walter didn't say a word when someone showed him the picture. He just looked at it for a long time, then handed the phone back. "That's not mine," he said quietly. "I didn't put that there." He didn't need to. By now, people had started to understand that this story wasn't about proof. It wasn't about winning or numbers or money. It was about presence, about being seen, about a promise whispered into the dark and answered in a language no one could quite explain but everyone could feel. And somehow, the statue kept listening. Walter didn't buy a new truck. He didn't move to Florida. He didn't vanish overnight or show up on morning talk shows shaking hands and smiling for flashing cameras. When the lottery officials contacted him, he answered their questions politely. When the check came, he signed it with a hand that didn't tremble. And then, for 3 days, he sat in his kitchen, staring at the figure on the slip of paper like it had been written in a language he didn't understand. $38 million. It felt like a joke, like a number meant for someone else. Walter still drove the same rusted sedan with a cracked dashboard. He still drank instant coffee. He still used the same chipped mug Ruth gave him 20 Christmases ago. What did he need that money for? His life wasn't lacking, not in the way people meant when they talked about winning the lottery. He had food. He had quiet. And now, it seemed, he had been given an answer. So he walked the check over to the parish office. The secretary was new, young, sweet, the kind who still thought miracles came with lightning and loud voices. She stammered when she saw the amount, asked him if he was sure. Walter just smiled and slid the envelope across the desk. "I'd like it to go to the chapel," he said. "The roof needs replacing, and the steps are soft near the statue. Maybe a path for the folks in wheelchairs." The diocese declined at first, said large donations had to be reviewed, said they couldn't accept funds tied to gambling, even if legal, said it might send the wrong message. Walter didn't argue, just nodded, thanked them, and left. That night, Bishop Carrington called him personally. He sounded tired, older than Walter remembered, like someone who'd seen too much of the world and not enough of its grace. "Mr. Greaves," the bishop said, "I had a dream last night about the statue on Mill Street." She was weeping, but it wasn't sadness. It was joy. They accepted the donation the next day. Walter made no public statement. He asked for no plaque. He didn't want the path named after him. The only thing he requested was a wooden table beneath the statue, something small and plain where people could leave flowers or notes without setting them on the ground. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. The check covered the repairs. Volunteers returned to paint and patch. The statue remained untouched, of course, but the space around her began to glow in a way that had nothing to do with sunlight. Walter kept cleaning her each morning. He never once mentioned the money to the crowds that passed him on the way up the hill. He just stepped aside, nodded, and let them have their moment. Because what had been given to him quietly, impossibly, was never meant to be kept. It was meant to be returned. The statue never moved. That was the most remarkable part. Through everything, the whispers, the windless nights, the wax numbers, and the millions of dollars, it stood in the same place it always had. Arms open, eyes lowered, not changing, but somehow changing everything around it. And maybe that was the miracle all along. Not the lottery. Not the blue light or the dream or the bell that some swore they heard once at 3:33 a.m. sharp. Maybe it was the way silence turned sacred when people stepped near her. Maybe it was the way an old man's daily act of care could open a door none of them knew had been closed. Walter cleaned her every morning until the day he left. It wasn't a dramatic exit. No farewell party, no big announcement. One morning, he arrived like always, cloth in hand, thermos in his coat pocket. The sky was pale gold, and the chapel lawn shimmered with dew. He wiped the statue's base, brushed a few petals from her feet, then stood back, looked at her for a long moment, and smiled. He left a folded envelope on the wooden table. Inside was a note written in the same blocky handwriting Ruth used to tease him about. 4 words. "You remembered me, W." He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He simply packed his things, left a modest sum for the town library, and boarded a bus that no one could quite confirm the destination of. Some said he moved to be near a niece in Ohio. Others claimed he joined a monastery out west. A few thought he simply went off to find another chapel, another statue, another place to whisper his prayers and hear them whispered back. But even after he left, something remained. People still came. Some were locals. Others were strangers who had only heard fragments of the story. Man wins lottery, statue never wet, something about candle wax. They came not for proof, but for presence. Some left behind letters, some left prayers scribbled on the backs of gas station receipts. Some came and said nothing at all. They just stood beside her, in the stillness. The statue was never declared miraculous by any church authority. There were no Vatican inquiries, no official pilgrims or canonized shrine status, but no one minded. Faith doesn't always wait for headlines. And over time, something changed in Fairgrove. The chapel was repaired, yes, but more than that, it was returned to. The silence inside no longer felt abandoned. It felt held, alive. The statue became more than a landmark again. She became part of people's stories, new ones, old ones, ones just beginning. Some say you can still feel Walter there if you visit early enough. A quiet warmth in the breeze, a softness in the way the sun hits the marble, a presence that lingers, not loudly, but faithfully. Because this wasn't a story about luck. It was a story about being seen, about a vow whispered in weariness, about a statue that listened, and a man who never stopped showing up until the day he was finally answered.